Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, audience of Arktos, Interregnum, Arktos, Werewolf now. Welcome to this 10th podcast of Werewolf. We are going today be interviewing somebody that is not only important to our dissident movement international, but also somebody who's aware with a theme that is very important at the moment, namely the state of affairs in Britain, something that all dissident writers around the world have been following with great interest and which we would appreciate to hear first-hand information about instead of relying on censored mainstream media. There are three reasons why Arktos is doing this interview. The first is, of course, that we always support Patriotic Alternative and the movement that it has started in Britain. I would like to remind our audience in this regard of the predicament of several of its supporters and members. Links will be provided for the audience to support, for example, Samilia, who is still imprisoned because of his ideas and because of his support for the nationalist movement in Britain. The second reason that we are doing this is that Arktos is making a comeback and is reinventing itself and would like on its new formula also to reintroduce Mark Collett to our audience. And the third reason, of course, is that above all, we like to remind our movement that Arktos is providing ideas and books and publications, but our movement is also an activist movement. It's also a political movement. And if anybody stands for all of these elements, then it's Mark Collett, who has published, who has done activism, and who has also shown political engagement all around. So, Mark, welcome back to our show, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for such a kind introduction. It's always a great pleasure to join people like yourself, and I think the work that Arktos does is absolutely fantastic. You've published a number of wonderful books, you've supported authors within this movement, and I think what you said is very correct in that we need to be a multifaceted movement. We need to have activism, we need to have podcasts, we need to have authors, publishers, filmmakers. We need to provide an entire range of different outlets for our politics. We can't simply focus on one thing, and Arktos provides an important outlet for those who want to publish wonderful books, and you've been doing that for some time, and I fully support it.
Well, as Patriotic Alternative has many problems in the last years, including being excluded still from the election process, certainly at the national level, which is, of course, something that's bureaucratic sabotage, let's call it for what it is. Which limits your ability to affect the political debate, except from the sidelines and indirectly. But of course, politics from the get-go has been one of the pillars of our dissident rightist endeavor, our movement. And one of the things that I found very remarkable about the recent British election, about which is the first question, is that there was no real voter participation. So voter turnout was much lower than in previous elections. Everybody has pointed that out. The surprise result of the election is not that surprising given this state of affairs. And of course, the absence of any real nationalist option to vote for people in Britain. Will you say something about the British election results, which are quite recent, in fact, because your prime minister, although he's presiding over quite a series of events, has only been sitting there quite shortly, just a few weeks. Can you give us your assessment?
Well, I actually did a 2-hour-long lecture on my Odyssey channel, which was sort of a live stream followed by questions and answers, where I discussed something which is quite an interesting point for British nationalists and for other nationalists all over the world who are looking in at what we're facing and are asking themselves, why isn't there a powerful elected nationalist force in Parliament? Because you see in places like Germany, in places like France, in places like Italy, a large pushback, and you have these very, very powerful, well-funded electoral movements. Now, they're more populist in nature. So you have the National Rally in France, you have the AfD in Germany, and obviously you have people like Giorgia Meloni in Italy. Now, these are populist movements. They don't always do exactly what we want. And sometimes, notably in the case of Giorgia Meloni, they get elected and immediately betray the people who voted for them. But in the UK, historically, there hasn't even really been an electorally successful populist movement when it comes to British parliamentary politics. Now, there has been populist movements that have been successful, and there has been one ethno-nationalist party that had limited electoral success, but that was never at a parliamentary level. No one had ever previously breached that barrier until the elections that took place earlier this year. Now, I did a 2-hour lecture on this and explained exactly why. We have a system in this country of first past the post voting, which unfortunately tends towards a two-party system. It creates this two-party system and it produces minority governments. Now, obviously, people who want to know more about this is sort of an hour-long podcast, an hour and 15 minutes, but people who want to know more about this can go and watch that lecture that I did that was a live stream. It's still up on Odyssey. You can also find it on Rumble and BitChute for that matter. It's called Is the Electoral Route a Dead End? Now, in that, I put over a lot of points, but those points that I made have been absolutely backed up and proved correct at the recent elections, because you have Keir Starmer, who the media are saying this guy is super popular, he's won a landslide, he's got 2/3 of the seats in Parliament, yet at the same time he only took 1/3 of the popular vote, and in fact he gained fewer votes than his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn, who was regarded as a complete and utter failure. So that tells you just how broken the electoral system is. Now, turnout was a little lower than usual. It was around 60%. Usually for a general election, it's sort of 65% plus, usually around 70%. Most of the reduction in turnout was actually Conservative Party voters who either for one reason or another decided to stay at home. Now, these people have been driven away from the Conservative Party, but didn't quite have the heart to go out and vote for Reform or for another anti-immigration party. So most of those people have become disenfranchised with the mainstream Conservative Party because of the Conservative Party's failure to get a grip of immigration, despite successive prime ministers all making very bold claims. So you had David Cameron, he came to power on the promise that mass immigration would be coming to an end, that net migration would be in the tens of thousands. Theresa May then came to power on pretty much the same pledge, that mass immigration would be coming to an end. Fundamentally, net migration would be down under 100,000, again in the tens of thousands. She then got the boot. Boris Johnson came in. He wasn't talking about numbers, but he talked about a tough Australian points-based immigration system that would cut immigration and allow us to take back the power over migration. That resulted in record numbers of migrants coming in. Then finally, we did have Liz Truss. She was only around for 40 days, so we're not going to talk about her. But then we had Rishi Sunak, who started talking about stopping the boats and a plan to repatriate illegal migrants to Rwanda. I think about 2 migrants in total ended up going to Rwanda. It was a complete flop. It cost hundreds of millions. I think it cost about £300 million. Now, don't quote me on that, but I think it was in that ballpark for 2 people to be basically sent to Rwanda. So at the cost of £150 million or thereabouts per migrant, complete waste of time. didn't have any effect, and we're seeing record numbers of people coming in. So a lot of Conservative Party voters were like, well, we don't want to vote Conservative anymore because you've repeatedly let us down. Now, many of those people went and voted for Reform. Reform did very well. They took over 14% of the vote. They got a number of MPs elected, 5 in fact. This was a massive, massive breakthrough because, as I said previously, no populist party had ever broken that barrier. But a lot of those Conservative voters, unfortunately, whilst not able to vote Conservative anymore, still didn't feel they were able or there was any point in going and voting for someone else. Thankfully, Nigel Farage did. Now, Nigel Farage, we'll talk about him in a second. He did finally break that barrier. And for the first time in British political history, an anti-immigration party broke through at a parliamentary level. Now, there's a little caveat there. And that caveat is that previously we have had UKIP MPs, but they weren't really UKIP MPs. They were Conservative Party MPs that crossed the floor and then got re-elected under a new banner. But they were already sitting MPs that got to their position via a mainstream route. This is the first time in history when a political party that is anti-immigration has had people elected to Parliament under their own steam. Now, no one managed that before. Sir Oswald Mosley didn't manage that. John Tyndall didn't manage that. Nick Griffin didn't manage that. No one did. This is the first time that's ever happened. So despite being a lower turnout, and despite Keir Starmer getting in with this record parliamentary majority, which is completely unreflective of his support in terms of votes, there was a wonderful development at this election, and that is that the political landscape changed fundamentally because a populist anti-immigration party is now sitting in Parliament. Now, obviously, Nigel Farage isn't exactly on our wavelength. He is still, to some degree, a multiculturalist. He is still somebody that will pay lip service to multiracialism, to immigrants that have come here that he thinks have in some way enriched Britain. But he is still fighting on a platform that we would largely endorse. His platform of stop the boats and deport all illegal migrants is actually a more hardline platform than what the BNP fought their successful European election campaign on back in 2009. So that tells you a couple of things. Firstly, times are changing. People are willing to vote outside of the mainstream. That is a positive. Secondly, the Overton window has shifted dramatically in the past decade, so much so that populist parties are now openly talking in terms that ethno-nationalist parties wouldn't have over a decade ago. And finally, the other positive is that Nigel Farage has been dragged into a space that he previously would never have entered under his own volition. We've dragged him to a point where he's talking about issues of remigration, which are quite explicitly ethno-nationalist talking points. And all of these things, are good. Obviously, it's not good Keir Starmer being in power, but the shift in terms of what people are talking about, the shift in terms of Reform talking about issues that we as ethno-nationalists would talk about, and the fact that they broke through, they are positive developments.
Yes, you remind us, of course, of the whip function of our movement. That is to whip the civil nationalists into line, to get them to do things that are functional for us, that we promote. In Holland, we have, of course, my country, we have faced the same problem. We have now Geert Wilders, the leader of the PVV party, finally being the first coming out of the elections, supporting a new government, a so-called technocrat government, which is sitting in power. But I like to remind people of the difficulties of this. So nationalists, real nationalists, have been trying to whip this party into line. That's our function. But what we see is that the system, the sitting parties have all kinds of ways to sabotage whatever even civil nationalists would want to do for our nation. The net result of our elections, also recent elections in Holland, are that the cabinet being formed just a couple of months ago, that the numbers, the incoming numbers, which are weekly announced online, immigrants, asylum applicants, are now the same level as they used to be before. So it's 800, it's constant, of course, 800 being the number of first applicants, being followed by family reunification and secondary applications. So you can triple or quadruple that number on a weekly basis. So that's on a weekly basis. So you can imagine a small country like Holland being swamped by these numbers. These have not altered. That's an important point to make. It's not impossible that it will still alter, but problems are there with any civil nationalist movement, of course. Now, you talked about the loss of faith to a certain extent in the British electorate, but on the other hand, the great breakthrough that has been made, which indeed is very hopeful. But of course, we also see the reaction of, let's say, the regime. I call it the globalist regime that's in power in all our Western countries. So this regime is answering with censorship, unprecedented censorship in the case of the UK, clamp down on public opinion. Your colleagues, your friends are either incarcerated or gagged, suffering all kinds of persecution. Your movement has been deplatformed from almost everything that's imaginable. And I've heard people say that Britain now is, the censorship in Britain now is taking on cartoonish forms, so ridiculous form. Can you say something about that before going into the events of the last weeks? This development has been going on some time. What's the state of affairs as far as censorship now in your country, the UK?
Well, censorship in the UK is off the scale. I mean, it's literally as if they took George Orwell's 1984 and used that not as a work of fiction, but as a manual to how to oppress people. There are numerous things I could discuss here, from the proposed plans for Ofcom, which is the way they basically, the Office of Communications, it's the way they regulate TV channels, etc. They want to give them the power to completely control the internet in the UK, to control social media, and to basically levy fines to websites and media hosting sites that would say, maybe upload this podcast, because they will have what they're going to call official narratives. And if you speak out against the official narrative, which they're going to say is the truth, and you counter signal that and you say something that's the opposite of that, you can then, if you're hosted on a particular platform, be the reason that platform gets a sizable fine. So they're looking to completely change the way the internet works in the UK, regulate it, and not necessarily drag, the owners of companies into court, but levy fines to ensure that those websites or those social media sites are shut down. They are also talking about changing the way that social media posts work. Now, I did an extensive video on this, but the way social media posts will now work is that if somebody reads a social media post and perceives that post as being something that might offend someone, so it doesn't have to have caused offense. So, if you write something, say I, as a British citizen, was to write something, that post wouldn't actually have to offend anyone to be removed. It would simply have to be perceived by someone to potentially be offensive to someone else. And at that point, it can be removed as a post that potentially could cause harm, offense, or cause somebody in some way to, have an adverse reaction to reading it. So at that point, you're also moving into sort of this hazy area of pre-crime that essentially your opinions have to be censored because they may be cause for some kind of criminal act. They could cause some kind of harm in the future. That no one can be sure they will cause that harm. No one has been harmed, but potentially, because harm might be caused in the future, those posts have to be removed. Now, that's another worrying aspect of what we're seeing. We're also seeing a clampdown on what the government are calling disinformation. So as we speak, people are being dragged out of their homes in Britain for posting things on social media that the government deems as inaccurate, and that those inaccuracies may have caused civil disorder or could have caused civil disorder. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, how far-reaching is that? Well, the Director of Public Prosecutions recently made a public media statement where he told people that a retweet would be enough. So if somebody posts something, if it's had, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of likes, multiple retweets, and you retweet that as well, you are just as liable for retweeting it as the person who initially posted it. Now, that is terrifying, because some of these tweets, as I said, have hundreds of thousands of retweets. That would mean that potentially hundreds of thousands of people, if they were based in the UK, were liable for criminal action. At that point, the government can literally swoop on anybody for the most minor infraction. And some of these things that I'm discussing, they wouldn't fall under incitement. So we're not talking about people going on social media and talking about, let's go and burn down this, asylum seeker hostel, or this person needs killing, or something like that, which would clearly fall under laws which are decades and decades old. The incitement laws in Britain go back centuries. These are new laws, and they cover things such as telling a man that he's a man. And the draconian response has led to the convening of these 24-hour Soviet-style courts to deal with people who have been caught up in the recent disorder, which obviously also include people who simply posted things to social media. And there have been cases in this country, exactly like I'm putting forward, where people have said, look, this guy is clearly a man, he's a man in a wig, he's not a woman. They have been dragged out of their homes, and the restrictions placed upon those people have been unbelievable. The restrictions have banned them from owning a mobile device, banned them from having any internet in their home, and have allowed the police to enter their home at any time of the day or night they wish to carry out emergency searches to ensure that none of the other restrictions are being broken. So we are living in a police state already, and this police state is a politically motivated police state. And something else, which is a bit of an eye-watering statistic, is that you are 16 times more likely to be arrested in Britain for making a social media post than you are to be arrested in Russia for the same thing. So the British government is constantly saying that all of the disinformation, all of these problems that we're seeing in the UK, it's all being pushed by, Russian hackers, Russian bots, the Russian government, it's Russian disinformation, and Russia are trying to take away our freedoms. Well, the only people trying to take away the freedoms of British citizens are the British government, because it's the British government that are passing these laws and are basically diverting police officers and police resources into monitoring social media. So something that was announced recently is that Keir Starmer wants an entirely new police force, which will simply exist to monitor social media activity. And that tells you how far we're going down this road. There are entire police forces in Britain that for multi-year periods haven't solved a single burglary, yet those police forces are diverting vast resources, vast amounts of money to having officers sat in rooms, presumably 24/7. These rooms are being manned, day and night, where officers just comb through social media posts and then dispatch other officers to arrest people based on what are little more than thought crimes.
Well, the priorities of the British regime, they are clear. So the Rotherham and other grooming gang scandals that happened in your country, they were not persecuted at all for many years. People could get away with incredible things, but when they speak out for simple things that they observe that cannot take place. I would like to remind people that internationally it has been noticed what's happening in the UK. I'm giving a short example. Leo Homan on his Substack yesterday wrote an article, and I will read the first paragraph. The UK's crackdown on free speech in light of the migrant crisis should not be viewed in a vacuum. It contains the globalist model to collapse the US and all of Western civilization. Do not be fooled. The globalist game plan unfolding in the UK is the same plan as they have for the United States of America. It revolves around weaponized immigration. Schools in the UK will begin teaching students about so-called misinformation and the dangers of extremist content as the nation continues to devolve into violent street riots fueled by Islamic migrants. So that was the short excerpt just to show people how much the perception of Britain is also being changed. And this brings us, of course, to the main topic, namely the topic of what has happened recently. So a few weeks after your new prime minister came to power, your country descended into chaos. Now, I must say, it is very difficult to get accurate news here in continental Europe, probably elsewhere as well. The mainstream media hardly reports anything of it or shows large anti-racist demonstrators in large groups. The only statements that we hear indicating the problems are that there are riots led by far rightists, not talking about the root causes of these riots. And it's very difficult, even on social media, to find accurate information. I believe that the clampdown is one of the most stringent I've ever seen. I have quite a large network, and so do my friends, but they can hardly get any accurate information about what happened in Britain, really. Can you just give a brief overview for the benefit of our international audience?
Well, this all started a few weeks ago when there was the horrific murder of 3 little girls at a dance class in Southport. Now, a man of, well, he was 17 years old at the time, but it was a week before his 18th birthday. And he burst into the dance class with a knife. He began stabbing people. Sadly, 3 of the little girls he stabbed died. A further 8 were hospitalized, and 2 adults who were presumably trying to stop him were also hospitalized. So this was a major incident, and it resulted, as I said, in 3 little girls dying. Now, the 17-year-old guy who did this, he was of Rwandan descent. There's 2 stories, and I can't seem to get to the bottom of it. His parents either came here as asylum seekers and then he was born here, or he arrived in Britain in around 2006 with his parents. So he's either the offspring of migrant asylum seekers who were granted asylum, or he's an asylum seeker himself. Either way, he's of Rwandan descent. Both his parents were definitely born in Rwanda. Now, he made his way to Southport specifically to stab these girls, to commit an atrocity like this. And this cannot be viewed in a vacuum. So the way the government are talking about it, I'm sure the way the foreign media are talking about it, is as if this is some kind of unavoidable tragedy, it's a one-off, and they can't possibly fathom why people are so angry. But this is not a one-off. Just the week before, a young soldier was stabbed outside a barracks in Kent, again by a man of African descent. And last year, we had something very similar, where a man of African descent went on a rampage in the city of Nottingham, killing 3 people. And obviously, there have been other cases like this. There was the Manchester Arena bombing. Again, a young migrant went into an Ariana Grande concert. As the concert was finishing, he walked through the doors as people were being let out, and he detonated a suicide bomb, which killed I think it was over 20 young girls. Now, this has been bubbling away for some time. And finally, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, and people began to spontaneously come out and protest. The first protest was in Southport itself. Now, that ended in disorder. And again, there's been a lot of disinformation about this. The reason disorder broke out in Southport was because there was a man who looked as if he was of migrant descent. He looked as if he was Muslim, or he looked as if he was from the Middle East, or maybe from the Indian subcontinent. And he turned up and was arrested wielding a knife. Now, this obviously caused tensions to boil over. You've got people out there holding a vigil and protesting about 3 little girls being stabbed by a migrant. And what appears to be another migrant then turns up with a knife. And there was disorder. And during that disorder, a local mosque had an exterior wall, sort of a small, maybe sort of waist height wall pushed over. And the way the politicians reacted to this was insane. It was clear that politicians were more concerned that a small wall had been pushed over outside a mosque than they were that 3 white British girls had been stabbed to death and another 8 were wounded. And this could tell you everything you needed to know about the priorities of the British government. Keir Starmer then made an address to the nation where he announced a whole raft of draconian policing measures, where he talked ill of those at the protest as a group, and where he announced a number of protections for ethnic minority communities. Never once did he announce any protections for white girls, for white communities, or talk about the underlying problem, which is obviously mass immigration, hundreds and hundreds of migrants arriving per day in boats on our southern border. He never talked about stopping any of that. He never talked about people's justifiable concerns, and this fanned the flames. Then hundreds of protesters up and down the countries, well, thousands, in fact, of protesters up and down the countries spontaneously came out of their houses and started to be involved in what became violent disorder. Now, the government has called these people far right. They're not far right. They're not connected with myself. They're not connected with Tommy Robinson. They're not connected with any group. They're just people who are justifiably angry about what happened. Now, I don't condone violent disorder. I don't think people should be attacking the police. I do think there's a better way. I think people need to get organized on a community basis and engage in a white form of the civil rights movement. There needs to be a white civil rights movement. But these people are people that have been neglected. They have been mocked, they've been dispossessed, they've been ignored, and at best, they've simply been given the crumbs from the table for decades. And they reacted in an angry manner because finally their anger boiled over. And what was Keir Starmer's response to this? Well, thousands of people have been arrested, many for what we would regard as non-crimes, as non-criminal actions. Those people are being held without bail. Keir Starmer has convened 24-hour Soviet-style courts, and people are being handed the harshest sentences imaginable for things such as shouting at police officers. One guy's got 26 months for shouting at police officers. Young boys as young as 12 are being told they will serve jail sentences. People are being told that they will serve custodial sentences for merely being at protests where violent disorder broke out. People are having their doors kicked in for posting things on social media. Grandmas are being arrested and dragged out of their houses for apparently purchasing eggs and flour, which were used to be thrown at police officers by those involved in disorder. And what you're seeing here is all in stark contrast to what took place in 2020, when Black Lives Matter rioters, marauded through city centres, attacked people, looted shops, vandalised monuments, threatened war memorials, and dumped statues into rivers. Yet only 135 arrests were made in total, and very few, if any, actually went to jail. In fact, judges let people involved in serious violent disorder and the destruction of public property walk free from court with conditional discharges, which, for those who are not in the UK, a conditional discharge is when you're told, please don't be a naughty boy again. All the charges are effectively dismissed unless you commit that same offence again within a certain period, and people walk free from court with no damages whatsoever. So what's happening here not only illustrates the two-tier justice system, but it illustrates the level of contempt the British government have for the people, and the fact the British government have no intention whatsoever of dealing with people's underlying concerns and legitimate grievances with mass immigration and the fact that white British people are constantly being terrorized by the migrant community.
Even somebody like Elon Musk said, he told your prime minister, two-tier star, because there are two justice systems now in place. Apartheid has come to Europe finally, but in another way than many people would have wanted to see. And I would like to remind the people that listening to this podcast that this problem of mob rule, mob action is inevitable as long as our movement cannot have a political face. So as long as ethno-nationalists are kept out of the public debate, are kept out of the political arena, there is no way legitimate grievances can be heard. The civil nationalists will not let them be heard, or they will falsify information. They always do. And the only way for this kind of anger to be channeled is through letting legitimate spokespeople, like Mark Collett here, speak in public, let them be heard in public. But of course, that's exactly what is not happening. Instead of that, we are seeing a doubling down by the regime and falsification of information. So you're talking about the misinformation, in fact, by the government, drawing attention to incidents that do not pertain to the real issues at hand, deflecting attention away from underlying issues to incidents that happen or purported incidents. And in my own country, Holland, we have seen the same. So there has been a spate of knife attacks a couple of years ago. Knife attacks on bus stations, train stations in public sphere that have been largely swept under the carpet. Only local newspapers have reported on these kind of things until a driver of foreign descent decided to plow his car into a crowd in front of the central station in Amsterdam, at which point this man was labeled manic. He had psychological disorders, but obviously his motivations, they came to light. It was let's say, a terrorist attack. But this kind of events, this kind of incidents, of course, they are building up a certain critical mass among our people. And you said this was the straw that broke the camel's back in Britain. What is the present state of affairs? Because there has been a clampdown in the media. People have been arrested en masse. Clearly, the regime is intent of stamping out this wildfire in the early stages by draconian measures. Is it working? What do you?
Well, firstly, before I answer that question, sort of about the effects of this clampdown, I do want to circle back to something you just said, because it's exactly what happens in this country. So whenever somebody, specifically when someone of African descent goes on sort of a stabbing spree, a killing spree, but this does apply to other migrants. So you say you have a Roma gypsy or someone like that, commit a stabbing, they are always taken into custody, and very quickly their social media disappears, their entire online footprint disappears, so no one can actually see what their motivations were. Then you will soon find that a motion is being made to declare that person, you know, mentally unfit to stand trial, usually sort of some kind of diminished responsibility defense. And this is exactly what happened a year ago in Nottingham. So earlier on, I said, you know, there's been numerous incidents like this. There's been a number of things that have built up. And, you know, the Southport stabbings were effectively the straw that broke the camel's back. But one of those incidents was the killings in Nottingham, where a black man went on a rampage and killed 3 people. Now, he is currently serving an indefinite sentence in a hospital, because when it came to court, he immediately pled guilty to a lesser charge. So in the UK, we have 2 charges. One is murder. So if you kill somebody, well, there's 3 charges. There's murder, manslaughter, and accidental death. Murder is a premeditated act of killing someone. Manslaughter is when you kill someone via an act of violence, but there isn't any premeditation or planning, or you committed a violent act. So you punched somebody and they fell over, and as they fell over, they hit their head on a paving stone and it gave them, a bleed on the brain and they died. You clearly weren't intending to kill them, but you committed a violent act that led to their death. And finally, there's accidental death, which we're not talking about here, because accidental death is when, you're doing something and it results in somebody's death, but it's clearly an accident. Now, this man was initially charged, the Nottingham killer was initially charged with murdering those 3 people. But as soon as he got to court, he entered a guilty plea of manslaughter based upon diminished responsibility, based upon the fact that he didn't know what he was doing, that he wasn't in control of himself, that he was mentally unfit to be amongst normal people when he committed those murders. Now, that's incredible, because immediately the Crown Prosecution Service accepted that guilty plea. So the killer, the Nottingham killer, will not spend a day in prison. He will instead spend an indefinite period in hospital. But an indefinite period in hospital sounds a lot worse than it is. Firstly, you're not sent to prison. You're not treated as a prisoner. And secondly, indefinite means a minimum term of 2 years. It's indefinite, but it's a minimum term of 2 years. So if after 2 years, doctors, psychologists, etc., deem him to be mentally fit, because the Crown have accepted he was mentally unfit when he committed the killings, as soon as a doctor deems him mentally fit, he will be eligible to apply for release. This means that after as little as 2 years in a hospital, he could be back on the streets. And this regularly happens. When someone of African descent commits one of these unthinkable acts, it is immediately written off as diminished responsibility. Now, why am I laboring this point? Because, and this is very interesting, this young man, well, he is now a man, he's turned 18, the killer who murdered the 3 little girls in Southport, the press is already laying the groundwork for the diminished responsibility plea. Now, obviously, I could be wrong. He may not go for the whole diminished responsibility plea, but the press is laying the groundwork for this. Now, as we're talking, I am scrolling back through my Telegram feed as quickly as I can to read you an actual headline so that your viewers, your listeners, can understand just how anti-white the media and the system is in the UK, and how the media will paint these migrant killers as effectively pillars of the community that just had a moment of madness. And the headline I'm going to read for you is not from a left-wing paper. It's not from the BBC. It's not from some anti-white activist group. It's actually from the Daily Mail. Now, the Daily Mail is Britain's premier, supposedly right-wing news source. And this is how they talked about the Southport killer. They described him as, here it is. This is the exact quote. Quiet choir boy, 17, accused of murdering 3 girls at Southport dance class, has been diagnosed with autism and hadn't left his house or spoken to his family for a period of time. And the picture they used of him was probably taken when he was about, 12 or 13 years of age. He was young, he was small, he was smiling, he's wearing his school blazer, his school tie, he looks very smart. And to go alongside this, the Daily Mail then ran a second headline, revealed how Southport stabbing suspect Axel Ruda-Cabana, dressed as Doctor Who for a BBC Children in Need fundraising video when he was 11. So again, another picture is published of this killer, but when he was 11 years of age, and he's dressed as Doctor Who, and the article gushes about how he wanted to be, you know, the first black Doctor Who, which is obviously a quintessentially British thing. Doctor Who is a quintessentially British sci-fi show with a time-traveling doctor who solves mysteries and fights aliens and robots. And he, you know, this little boy, he wants to be the first black Doctor Who because he's quintessentially British, but he's been having a bad time. You know, he's a choir boy. He goes to church every week. He sings in the choir, but he's having a bad time. He's snapped. He's had some sort of, you know, autism diagnosis. He hasn't been speaking to his friends. He hasn't been speaking to his family. And you can see where they're going with this. They are moving down the route of telling people already that there's a problem here, that this isn't some anti-white killing. This isn't some savage black murderer. No, he's a good boy. He's quintessentially British. He's done everything he can to fit in with our way of life, you know, accepting, you know, British pastimes, wanting to be a young Doctor Who. And he just had a moment of madness. And this is exactly what they say. So where are we now? Well, that's part of where we are. Part of where we are is that fundamentally they are already seeding the idea amongst the public that this 17, almost 18-year-old man was effectively just going through a bad time and had a moment of madness. Secondly, we are now seeing our rights and our freedoms taken away from us. And thirdly, we are seeing a huge astroturfed, government and union funded attempt to get anti-racists and migrants out on the street, all holding the same placards and the same signs to convince the public that actually the majority of people aren't angry about the stabbings. The majority of people don't want to stop the boats. And fundamentally, we live in a multicultural, progressive, happy society where everyone gets on with each other. So you can see the way that the system swings into action to silence protesters with the most draconian clampdowns we've ever seen. I've spoken about that earlier. We see the way that we're actually meant to feel sorry for these killers. We're meant to feel that they've had, you know, a bad time. And you see this all the time now, that whenever somebody does something heinous, if they're non-white, you have to live a day in their shoes. You have to understand all the hardships they faced, all the terrible things that have happened to them, and they couldn't possibly have done anything wrong due to some animus towards white people. And as I said, finally you then have everyone coming together, holding hands, singing Kumbaya, and the government and the media, even the right-wing media like the Daily Mail, you know, praising these anti-racist protesters who are singing Kumbaya and telling everyone that we all really do get along. And actually, by the end of all this, the message is clear. Society works. Yeah, there are these sort of tragic events that no one could possibly predict and just come out of the blue and we have to quickly forget. But the real problem in society isn't white girls being stabbed, it's the far right. The real problem, according to the media, the press, and the government, is that normal white people were angry about that stabbing. That's the real issue. The real issue that is ripping society apart isn't that white girls are being killed. It's that people are angry about white girls being killed. And to top it all off, if you want the cherry on top of the cake, and there is a big juicy cherry on the top of this particular cake, just days after, you know, the stabbings, the disorder, and these protests, we then hear in the media that a record number of migrants crossed our southern border in a single day, only to be whisked off to 4- and 5-star hotels at the cost of around £8 million per day to the taxpayer, and another group of people who could well go on to be the next knife-wielding maniac who chops down innocent white British girls. You know, they've come in, they've been welcomed, and the government are giving them everything on a plate. That is the state of modern Britain.
Well, it seems that Britain is not any more protected by its own fleet, but rather by whatever bad weather might prevail at a certain season. what you are
It's
talking about
it's a bit like the film 300, where they're all stood on the cliffs cheering, hoping that the weather destroys the Persian fleet, because that's the only thing we've got on our side. The only thing that's on the side of British people is what's called the British weather, which is typically bad. And British people, they don't want a nice, hot, summer with a calm sea breeze. They want thunder, lightning, tornadoes, because that's the only thing that's going to stop the invasion of Britain. The government aren't going to do it. And look, let's go back in time to, again, around 2000. When the COVID restrictions were in place, the government actually had the Royal Navy patrol southern beaches in order to arrest people who were out sunbathing. But when it comes to the invasion of those same beaches, where are the Royal Navy? Nowhere to be seen. In fact, all you have is our lifeguarding service being used as a taxi service to bring these people over. So we actually have boats sat out in the English Channel to look for migrant boats so that we can go load them onto the lifeguards boat and ferry them across here quicker and more safely. That is what our government is doing. And, here's a quick message to people. If you ever get a fundraiser for the Lifeguarding Association in Britain, for the RNLI, don't give them a penny, because that money goes towards bringing in our replacements.
I think you put your finger on a very sore spot in our societies, and I would call it democracy. So the rule of emotions, which is used by our media to manipulate our people, to foster a thing that you could call pathological altruism, of course, misguiding people through emotions, democracy. A good example in my own country is that the Wilders-sponsored government now try to actually, for the first time, deport illegal immigrants, a few, to Armenia. The moment that one boy was supposed to be exited from the country, a large demonstration, mainly by the usual suspects, boomers, activists, feminists, went on the streets in Amsterdam en masse, protesting. Of course, some of them might have been actually sponsored by other organizations to gain mass. In any case, that is what dominated the news cycle for several days, just in response to the attempted deportation of one person. You said they managed to deport 2 people to Rwanda, so Holland didn't achieve that. So even that part has not been achieved. But democracy is a
no. We have
part.
the same as you. We have the same as you, though. Other people, they have tried to deport several people over the last few years, including convicted rapists. Every time a convicted rapist is being deported, people on the plane, staff on the plane have refused to let the plane take off. In one case, the staff on the plane, the cabin crew, refused to allow an Air France flight to take off. And that Air France flight had a convicted rapist on board. He was allowed back into Britain only to rape someone else. If I had my way, those members of the cabin crew who had prevented that rapist from being deported would all be arrested and face the same sentence in prison as the rapist. They should be punished to the full extent of the law, and they should be put in that same cell with that rapist and spend the same length of time in prison that he does, because they absolutely assisted in that rape. By allowing him to walk free, they caused a British woman to be raped, and they should pay the price for that.
Well, the anti-law state that you're talking about reminds me of a saying by Solzhenitsyn. He said, a Marxist system can be recognized, Marxist justice system can be recognized by the fact that the innocent are in jail and the guilty are walking free. So that's certainly something that we are seeing in our countries. The last point I wanted to bring up, because we are talking here about a very serious incident, the killing of people. People tend to forget that. They get distracted by the response, the looting, the sensational pictures in the street, but the killing, taking of human life, and what kind of human life is being taken. white girls. You're talking about indigenous British girls. Some time ago, one of our fellow dissident publicists, Greg Johnson, he talked about the prospect, the eventual prospect of white genocide. When he talked about this prospect, he was laughed out of many occasions, not taken serious. His thesis was considered not only extremist, but laughable, ridiculous. But we can actually see some of this thing starting to happen at the moment. And if I look at this trajectory, it seems like we are on a slippery slope because our governments are actually facilitating hatred by what they are doing, by not taking action, by punishing the people that protest against inaction. Um, this is a self-reinforcing mechanism. It seems to me that we are on a trajectory towards white genocide. How do you see that? What do you think?
Well, genocide, can be defined in a number of wide-ranging ways, but ultimately it boils down to a destruction of the genes, a destruction of a group of people. And that can be brought about in many ways. It can be brought about by bringing in other hostile groups. It can be brought about by demoralizing a group, preventing natural births within a group. And I think all those things are being done to white people. If you read the UN definition of genocide, which anyone can bring up, there is a clear case to make that white people all over the Western world, so this isn't just happening in, say, America or the UK, this is also happening in Germany, France, Holland, Australia. White people all over the world are facing this nightmare. We are sitting in our homes as our governments import hundreds of thousands, millions in the case of the UK, of hostile people who are then handed everything on a plate. They are encouraged to breed. Our people are taxed to death. They are encouraged not to breed. We are told, we need to go out to work, we need to pay our taxes, we need to fill our pension pots. And then we are told, well, we have to bring all of these people in because you've not had enough children. Well, you told us not to have children. And you can see there are these double standards. You can see there are these narratives. The narrative not to have children, then the narrative, well, you must accept your replacements because you didn't have children. This is all a carefully planned out and carefully choreographed attempt to replace and displace white people. That is absolutely genocide. White genocide is very real. And, the UN, the European Union, numerous bodies have talked positively about replacement migration. The only time replacement migration is called a conspiracy theory is when people talk about it in a less than positive manner. So if you say, well, I don't like the idea of a replacement migration, then you're a racist and you're peddling conspiracy theories. If you turn around and say, replacement migration is a positive thing because it enriches Western countries, it replaces the aging white population, and there's going to be a natural shift towards different ethnic groups colonizing the West, and that's a good thing for reasons, well, you can say that. Then it's not a conspiracy theory. Then you get a polite round of applause. But nevertheless, replacement migration, which many major government and international bodies admit is taking place, and that they also admit that they are aiding and abetting, is something that does amount to genocide. And the fact of the matter is, white Britons now make up around 74.4% of the population in Britain. That's if you believe the government statistics, because government statistics are taken from a census, and the only people that fill out the census are the law abiders. It's decent people who pay their taxes, live here legally, illegal migrants, people who don't speak the language, large families in ethnic minority areas that have stuffed, 15 people into one house. They don't fill out the census properly. So 74.4% is best case scenario. We've already lost London. London is about 36% white British. We've already lost our second city, which is Birmingham. Birmingham is now around 42% white British. White genocide, replacement migration, however you want to call it, whatever you want to term it, is absolutely happening. It's happening in a way that is very visible. It's very jarring. That's why more and more people are talking about it. That's why the likes of Nigel Farage are saying we have to stop the boats. He's calling for net zero in terms of migration. He's saying we need net zero. We can't keep growing our population, you know, and he's right in saying that. And that's one of the reasons he is now sitting in Parliament and is to some degree, a voice for good. All of this is absolutely real, and normal people know it's real. That's why you have white flight. That's why you have new build estates popping up all over the countryside, because increasingly white people are fleeing the old cities, the old inner city areas that have become completely colonized, because there's no place for whites there. And whites that do live there either have to submit to foreign religions or bow down in some way, and if they don't, they are victimized. And that is the result of this replacement. And that's another thing that you have to remember. This replacement is not a kind thing. You know, people aren't being brought here to kindly care for us and ease us, you know, into the night peacefully and happily. Those who are replacing us are often carrying out violent acts which make our lives, you know, a nightmare scenario. And you've seen that play out in Southport. You've seen that play out in Nottingham. You saw that play out in Kent, where a young soldier was stabbed recently. You see these reports almost on a daily basis of young, often African youths committing stabbings, machete attacks all over the UK. Statistically, every hour in the UK, a machete attack takes place. During the recording of this podcast, statistically, one machete attack will have taken place somewhere in the UK. This replacement is not peaceful. It is absolutely white genocide. All of the facts are on our side. And even if you erase all of those facts from the internet, even if you ban us from speaking the truth and enlightening people to this white genocide, you only need a pair of functioning eyes to see what is happening. This is the visible, observable reality around us. Go to London, go to Birmingham, go to Bradford, Manchester, Luton, Leicester, Nottingham, and you can see the dramatic changes taking place, and they are taking place at a very, very rapid pace. I remember an area of Leeds called Richmond Hill. I stood there for election in 2003. I came second. I took 20% of the vote. Back in 2016, when we were campaigning for Brexit, I went back to that area and I was basically forced to leave when I was delivering pro-Brexit leaflets, because the area had changed so dramatically in just 13 years that white people had gone from being a majority in that area. It had gone from being a traditional white working class community to being an area that had been almost completely transformed in just over a decade. And a decade in, you know, historical terms, it is essentially a blink of an eye. We are seeing entire areas be lost to mass immigration like that. And the papers will then run stories in these areas saying, isn't it wonderful? 36 different languages are spoken in a Leeds school in the Richmond Hill area. That isn't progress. That is creating a melting pot that can't possibly work. It's taking an area that was ethnically homogenous, where everyone had a shared culture, a shared heritage, spoke the same language, knew each other, knew each other's families, and turning it into an area which, to put it politely, is absolutely balkanized, is an area where people can't relate to one another, an area where people can't even talk to each other, an area where there are racial tensions, an area where the white British are a hated minority.
Well, that reality is, of course, seen into the whole West. Here in Holland, I lived in a place, in a street, which I think there were like 200 people living there. There were only two Dutch people, two white indigenous Dutch people, including myself. So that shows you something about how far things can go also here. Um, White genocide, we talked about it, depressing topic. I like to remind our viewers, those that perhaps do not belong to the dissident right, but are interested in our point of view, namely that we are, this movement, the person that you are seeing here, Mark Collett and others, the last stop. This is the last stop before things get ugly, before things get out of hand. You might not like remigration, deportation, and stringent measures. You might not like it, but you might prefer law and reasonability and order to prevail because it is in all of our interests, including even the migrants, the people that are sent here to colonize our continents. Even it would be in their interest to let other voices be heard and to find a reasonable solution to this very scary scenario that is approaching us. That all being said, as a last question, Mark, give us some advice. Give your take on the dissident right movement and say what, in your view, should be our priorities at this moment.
I think for many within the dissident right, we have focused incorrectly over the last few decades on electioneering. In most countries now, especially in France, especially in Germany, Holland is another example of this, there are very successful populist movements that do well electorally. It's my belief that we should fundamentally leave elections to them. We should try to pull them further to the right. Those of us who aren't publicly exposed should join those movements, come up through the ranks and try to get elected to high office so that we can seed our ideas from a greater height. But we, as ethno-nationalists, must focus on something greater. There is the very realistic prospect that we will become a minority within our lifetimes. And in many cities and towns, white people have already reached minority status. Rather than competing with larger, better funded, electorally focused parties of a populist nature that are usually always going to beat us and we risk splitting the vote by going up against them, I believe we need to focus on education, training, public outreach, social media, creating our own communities, buying land, buying our own buildings. We need to build an alternative community that can shelter our people from the storm. We need to do that in multiple ways. And once we have done that, our community should focus its power on white advocacy. We need a powerful and robust white civil rights movement. That white civil rights movement should be able to advocate for our people legally. It should engage in activities that the left engaged in during the 1960s fight for civil rights. We should adopt their slogans, and we're doing things like that here in Britain, and I know things like that are happening elsewhere on the continent. There is an excellent guy in Sweden called Dan Eriksson. He is helping indigenous Swedes buy entire villages, parts of towns, and setting up little ethno villages. We're doing something similar in the UK. A group called the Woodlander Initiative are buying land up so that we can camp, so that we can fish, so we can hold public gatherings. We have a group called the Workers of England Union. We are now unionized. That means there is representation in the workplace for white people for the first time ever. We have already won numerous landmark cases for workers that have been sacked for refusing to wear the COVID masks, for standing for office, for espousing views that the company or people at the company didn't agree with. These are all things that we can do that are not covered by these more mainstream populist right parties that are dominating the electoral scene. I think we have to start thinking outside the box. Something we are already starting to do in Britain is ask for the names and prisoner numbers of people who have been arrested and incarcerated during these troubles, so we can write to indigenous political prisoners and offer them support. There are so many things we can do if we think outside the box, But I think the time for throwing millions of pounds, or in your case, millions of euros, into ethno-nationalist election campaigns when we're going up against bigger, more populist movements is long past. We should be spending that money on building our own breakaway communities and genuine pro-white advocacy. And as I said before, that doesn't mean we should let the populist sort of civic nationalist parties off. We should keep shifting the Overton window. We should be doing things like Keith Woods are doing. So Keith Woods has been immensely successful in reaching out to people like Elon Musk. We should be seeding our ideas, community building, and fighting for white civil rights, as well as building our own breakaway communities, creating white heartlands. Because if we create white heartlands, we'll have exactly what other ethnic minorities have. People know that there are Muslim enclaves in Britain. There are entire parts of towns dominated by Muslims. Well, what happens when those Muslims dominate those parts of town? Well, they elect then their own councillors. They have legitimate political, social, and community power. White people should now be looking at what other ethnic groups do in order to empower themselves, and we need to be doing that. And that's something that white ethno-nationalists can be at the forefront of, and it's essentially open ground. The political race is something which is occupied by numerous parties. It's overgrown. It's a mass of tangled weeds, and it's very hard to break through. However, there is open soil in all of the areas that I'm talking about. That is where we should sow our seeds going forward.
Well, with all these very useful, valuable advices and alternatives brought to us by Mark Collett, I'd like to thank you, Mark, for participating in this podcast, for all your advice and for all the things you told us about Britain. Links will be posted to support Patriotic Alternative and to find the information referred to here. I thank our audience for their attention. Goodbye.